The official reason for my dismissal from the city zoo was, quote, gross misconduct and reckless endangerment. The unofficial reason, the one whispered in the break room and implied in the stiff posture of my former boss, was that I was dangerously unhinged. They weren't entirely wrong. It was the red panda. Her name was Ember, and for weeks I'd felt a low thrum of anxiety coming from her, a frantic, silent broadcast of distress that coiled in my gut. I'm a zoologist. I'm trained to observe behavior, to interpret posture and scat and feeding habits. But this was different. This was a direct line, an unnerving, intuitive empathy that has been the quiet curse of my life. I don't hear words. I feel the shape of an animal's fear, the texture of its contentment, the sharp edges of its pain. That afternoon, the feeling from Ember wasn't just anxiety. It was a silent, frantic scream. It was a pressure building behind my eyes, a frantic scrabbling in my own mind. While families watched from behind the safety of the railing, I saw nothing but the wrongness emanating from her enclosure. It was an invisible knot, a flaw in the very air around her. So I acted. I vaulted the railing, scaled the low rock wall, and dropped into her habitat. The crowd gasped. Keepers shouted. But all I cared about was reaching the hollow log where she was hiding, her psychic shriek deafening me. I didn't know what I was looking for, only that I had to fix it. I just reached in and straightened a piece of metal wiring that had come loose from the enrichment feeder, a piece no one could have seen from the outside. The moment my fingers touched it, the screaming in my head stopped. Ember poked her head out, blinked at me, and the frantic energy was gone, replaced by a placid curiosity. By the time security arrived, I was just a man standing in a red panda enclosure with no logical explanation. Management branded me unstable. My gift, as I'd once foolishly tried to explain it to a therapist, was now a documented liability. Which is how I found myself jobless, broke, and mainlining stale coffee at 3 in the morning, scrolling through the dregs of the internet's job market. My sanity felt like a threadbare coat, and I was pulling at the loose strings. Then I saw it. The ad was less a job posting and more a shard of black glass embedded in the cheerful, corporate blue of the website. There was no company name, no logo, just a stark, minimalist box with a title. Nocturnal Biological Warden. The requirements were a series of cold declarative statements that felt more like warnings than qualifications. It stated plainly that an aversion to silence was a disqualifier. It demanded a candidate capable of radical compartmentalization and stipulated, with an odd finality, that there be no history of religious, spiritual, or metaphysical proselytizing. I snorted, a bitter laugh that died in the quiet of my apartment. Radical compartmentalization? I was a man who had just been fired for failing to compartmentalize a panda's panic attack. But then I saw the salary. It wasn't just high, it was obscene. It was the kind of money that didn't just pay your rent, it rewrote your past. It was enough to erase debts, to disappear, to build a new life on foundations so deep no one could ever find the old one. It was the kind of money that could buy me freedom from the person I was becoming. The unstable man who heard silent screams. With nothing left to lose but a sanity I was no longer sure I possessed, I clicked apply. The response was instantaneous. Not an automated, "We've received your application" email, but something else entirely. An encrypted file downloaded to my desktop. I opened it. Inside was a single image, a set of geographic coordinates, and a time for the following evening. The next day, I drove into the middle of nowhere, my beat-up sedan the only sign of life on a long, empty road. The coordinates led me to a monolithic concrete wall 20 feet high, crowned with what looked less like barbed wire and more like surgical implements. There was no intercom, no keypad. As my car approached, a slit in the gate glowed with a soft blue light, scanning my vehicle from bumper to bumper. A moment later, with a low hydraulic hiss, the massive steel gate slid open. It didn't feel automated. It felt expectant. The woman waiting for me inside a stark gray chamber introduced herself as Director Valerius. She was a study in precision, from her severe black suit to the unnerving stillness of her gaze. She gestured to a chair opposite her desk. This wasn't an interview, it was an autopsy, and I was the cadaver. She didn't ask questions, she made statements. "You were a promising zoologist at the city zoological park," she began, her voice a flat, emotionless monotone. "Your academic record is exceptional." She paused, her eyes locking onto mine. "You were terminated 2 weeks ago, not for endangering the Elias Thorne specimen, but because you acted on a non-verbal, non-behavioral cue. You were fired because you heard it." A cold shock went through me. For the first time, someone was describing my delusion as a faculty. "Your predecessor was terminated for what we deemed a failure of imagination," she continued, as if discussing a faulty piece of equipment. "He saw what was in front of him, but he couldn't conceive of what it implied. You, Mr. Thorne, have demonstrated an overabundance of imagination, or, as we prefer to classify it, unusual intuitive faculties." She slid a thick stack of papers across the polished black desk, a non-disclosure agreement so dense it could have stopped a bullet. "We don't hire employees, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, a sound that carried more weight than a shout. "We select components for a very sensitive machine. Your signature confirms your function." My hand trembled as I reached for the pen. I was trading my questionable sanity for a life-altering salary and a job that acknowledged the very thing that had ruined me. I was stepping off a cliff, not knowing if there was water below or only rock. I signed my name. The ink on my signature wasn't yet dry when Director Valerius stood. "This way, Mr. Thorne." There was no small talk, no welcoming platitudes. I had been assessed, acquired, and now I was being installed. She led me from the stark office into a corridor that seemed to swallow the light. We descended. Not in a conventional elevator with buttons and a pleasant chime, but in a pressurized chamber that dropped with a stomach-lurching smoothness. The air grew colder, scrubbed clean of any familiar scent, and a low, sub-audible hum began to vibrate in my bones. It was a pressure I felt in my teeth, a constant, deep thrum that suggested immense power being held barely in check. The security checkpoints we passed felt less like technology and more like ancient rituals. One gate required me to place my palm on a cool, dark plate that seemed to drink the warmth from my skin. Another scanned my retinas with a beam of crimson light that felt uncomfortably intrusive, as if it were reading the thoughts behind my eyes, not just the patterns of my iris. Valerius moved through them all with an air of bored ownership, a high priestess walking a path she had trod 1,000 times. We arrived at a locker room, empty save for a single open locker containing a dark gray uniform. The protective gear was laid out beside it. It looked like a standard biohazard suit, but when I picked up the chest plate, its weight was staggering, dense and unyielding. It was a burden before I even put it on. I ran a hand over the helmet. The visor was thick, crystalline. Inside, marring the view, were faint brownish stains that had resisted whatever cleaning process was used here, ghosts of some past incident. Then I saw the neck guard. It was scarred. Not with the frantic, messy bites of a panicked animal, but with a series of deep, gouging scratches. They were evenly spaced, precise, and chillingly deliberate. Whatever had made those marks possessed a terrifying, surgical precision. A cold dread, far deeper than the ambient chill of the facility, began to seep into me. This wasn't protection from animals, this was armor against monsters. Valerius watched me absorb this, her expression unreadable. "Your station is at the end of this hall. The operational protocols are displayed on the main console. Read them, memorize them. They are not guidelines, they are survival imperatives. Your shift ends at 0700. With that, she turned and walked away, her footsteps making no sound on the polished floor, leaving me alone with the hum and the haunted uniform. Dressed in the heavy gear, I walked into the main monitoring station. It was a semicircle of screens overlooking a long, wide corridor lined with enormous containment units. On the central screen, glowing in a stark, simple font, were the protocols. I began to read, and the true nature of my life-altering salary became terrifyingly clear. They weren't just rules, they were a litany of fear, My eyes scanned past the initial entries about power failures and atmospheric breaches until they landed on Rule 6. If you hear vocalizations that sound familiar, a family member, a past friend, your own inner monologue, leave the area immediately. It is not them. It is bait. A wave of nausea hit me, the casual horror of it, the assumption that the things here knew how to hunt not just your body but your history, your heart. I read on, my blood running cold. Rule 7 stated that if a containment door is found open, you are not to close it, do not investigate. You are to seal the corridor from your end and use the red phone. What is lost is already lost. The finality of it was absolute. There were no rescue missions here, only the sealing of tombs. My gaze drifted to the darkest part of the corridor on the screen, labeled Unit 7. The rule for it was a masterpiece of psychological terror. Rule 8. Do not allow the occupant of Unit 7 to form a complete image in your mind. Observe its effects on the environment, not the source. The danger wasn't what it could do to your body, but what the very knowledge of it could do to your sanity. The final rule I read cemented my isolation. Rule 10. You are the only authorized living human in your section after midnight. If you see another employee, they are not who they appear to be. Do not engage. Do not acknowledge. They are a symptom of a containment failure. I sank into the command chair, the weight of the uniform pressing down on me, a pale imitation of the crushing weight of those words. I was utterly, completely alone, in a place where the sound of my own thoughts could be a lure, and the sight of a friendly face was a death sentence. The low hum of the facility seemed to deepen, a predator's purr. I looked at the red phone on the console, a single point of contact in a world of unspeakable things. This wasn't a zoo, it was an abyss, and they had just handed me a flashlight with dying batteries. With the director gone, the silence of the facility pressed in, thick and heavy, broken only by the deep, resonant hum that felt like the building's own heartbeat. I settled into the command chair, the unfamiliar weight of the protective gear, a constant reminder of the invisible dangers. The row of high-definition screens before me offered a god's-eye view of the corridor, each one focused on a massive containment unit. My job, it seemed, was to simply watch. A tour of impossible biology, with me as the sole patron. My eyes were first drawn to the monitor for Unit 4. Inside, partially obscured by a manufactured rock formation, was a leg. It was long, jointed like an insect's, and covered in overlapping plates of what looked like polished obsidian. But they weren't static. As I watched, the plates shifted and realigned, gliding over one another with silent, hypnotic fluidity, like 1,000 tiny irises dilating and contracting in unison. At the end of the limb was a foot, and this is what made my breath catch. It had 6 toes, each tipped with a claw of some pale horn-like material. The foot tapped lightly against the thick, transparent wall of its enclosure. It wasn't a random tick, it was a complex, non-repeating sequence of sharp, dry clicks, a coded message tapped out for an audience that wasn't there. I forced myself to look away, my scientific curiosity warring with a primal sense of wrongness. The screen for Unit 5 showed a creature that defied easy classification. It was a nightmarish fusion of a centipede and a serpent, its long, segmented body moving with an unnatural fluidity that seemed impossible for its structure. It rippled through its habitat, a constant flowing current of dark, slick flesh. As it moved, it breathed. The sound came through the audio feed as a soft, rhythmic grinding, like a pestle crushing shards of glass in a stone mortar. It was a brittle, grating sound that set my teeth on edge, a sound of slow, constant destruction. Next was Unit 6. The enclosure was vast and filled with a dark, heavy-looking liquid. Suspended within was a being that was less a creature and more a symphony of impossible fins. They weren't flesh and bone, but membranes of pure, shifting color, shimmering like living auroras. They unfurled and contracted in ways that defied any known principle of aquatic locomotion. Its very presence seemed to bend the world around it. The light passing through the tank warped and distorted, as if I were viewing it through a powerful, flawed lens. The creature didn't just swim through the water, it seemed to be actively rewriting the space it occupied. Finally, my tour brought me to the end of the corridor, to the suffocating darkness of Unit 7. The monitor for it was black, not the black of a powered-down screen, but a profound, light-devouring void. It was a patch of absolute nothingness that seemed to suck the light from the corridor itself. There was no reflection, no hint of a shape within. My mind, trained to identify and categorize, rebelled against the emptiness. It strained to fill the void, to project a shape into the darkness, dredging up half-formed things from the sediment of my nightmares. A tangle of limbs, a field of unblinking eyes, a gaping maw. I felt a visceral pressure behind my own eyes and squeezed them shut, the words of Rule 8 echoing in my head. Do not allow the occupant to form a complete image in your mind. I physically turned my head away, the effort leaving me shaky. I retreated to the relative sanity of my console, trying to regulate my breathing. I was a zoologist. I was supposed to be cataloging life. But these things, they felt like a violation of life's very definition. I tried to focus on the task, making small notations in the digital log, my fingers feeling clumsy and slow. An hour passed, then two. The deep hum was the only sound, a constant companion in my isolation. Then I heard it. It was a whisper, so faint I thought it was a trick of the ventilation system or my own overwrought nerves. It came from the direction of Unit 7. I froze, straining to listen. It came again, and this time, there was no mistaking it. The voice was mine. It was a perfect echo of my own voice, but not as others hear it. It was the voice from inside my own head, the one I thought with. And it whispered a secret, a deep, childish fear I had never spoken aloud to another living soul. The man with the button eyes is under the bed, Elias. My blood turned to ice. The man with the button eyes. My 7-year-old self's name for the faceless terror that he was convinced lived in the shadows of his bedroom, a secret shame I had buried for decades. The creature in the darkness wasn't just mimicking me. It had reached into my mind, into my past, and pulled out the most private, fragile piece of my fear. It knew me. My hand shot out, my fingers wrapping around the cool, smooth surface of the red phone on the console. My knuckles were white. The rules weren't just a list of procedures. They were a shield. They were the only thing separating my sanity from the intelligent, predatory abyss that was actively trying to pry it apart. And it had just found the seam. My hand eventually retreated from the red phone, though the memory of its cool, unforgiving surface remained impressed on my skin. For hours, I sat rigid in the command chair, a sentinel in a tomb, my focus locked on the absolute silent blackness of Unit 7. The whisper had not returned, but its echo was branded into my mind. The quiet I had once found merely unsettling was now a predatory thing, a canvas waiting for the next terrifying brushstroke. It was deep into the third watch when the exhaustion and the ceaseless low hum of the facility had ground my nerves into a fine powder that I saw it. A flicker of movement on the monitor for the far end of the corridor. I leaned forward, my heart giving a hard, painful jolt against my ribs. It was a figure, unmistakably human, walking with a purpose that was entirely out of place in this sterile, silent world. Rule 10 screamed in my head. If you see another employee, they are not who they appear to be. Do not engage. Do not acknowledge. My hand hovered once more over the red phone. This was it. The test. The symptom of a containment failure. But the figure stopped and waved. It was a small, almost sheepish gesture. Then, with a fluid motion, he pulled off his helmet. The face was pale, drawn, with dark circles under eyes that were wide with a kind of manic energy, not malice. He wasn't calm or menacing. He looked like a man who had been screaming internally for a very long time. "The quiet gets to you, doesn't it?" he said. His voice was thin, reedy, barely carrying down the hall, but the audio sensors picked it up with perfect clarity. After a while, you start to wish something, anything, would make a sound. He took a few steps closer, his boots making soft, shuffling sounds on the polished floor. I remained frozen, my mind a battlefield between the cold logic of the rules and the unexpected humanity of the man approaching me. "I'm Silas," he said, stopping a safe distance away. "Silas Kane. I'm in Section B. I saw your name on the roster. Thorne, right? Elias Thorne." He saw the tension in my posture, the way my gaze kept flicking to the red phone. A frantic, desperate smile touched his lips. "Ah, you're thinking about the rules. Rule 10. The ghost in the machine." He shook his head, a gesture of profound weariness. "They're not rules, Thorne. They're psychological guardrails. They're for the weak. They put them there so you don't ask the right questions. So you just sit there and watch the pretty lights and collect your paycheck until you go insane from the silence." His desperation was a palpable force, radiating from him in waves. He needed to talk. He was overflowing with a terrible knowledge that was eating him from the inside out. "You replaced Russo, you know," he continued, his voice dropping. "They told you she had an accident, I'm sure. Some containment breach. A moment of carelessness. It's a lie." He leaned against the wall, his whole body trembling slightly. Russo didn't have an accident. Russo started hearing things. Whispers. Questions. She heard a question in her dreams, and she made the mistake of trying to answer it. She wasn't terminated, Thorne. She was unwritten. One day she was on the roster, the next, nothing. No final paycheck, no record she ever existed. They just edited her out. I stared at him, my own secret, the whisper from Unit 7, feeling like a hot coal in my chest. This man, this madman, was describing a world that made a terrifying kind of sense. He wasn't a symptom of a containment failure, he was a symptom of this place itself. He was what happened when you stared into the abyss for too long. "I'm not crazy," he whispered, his eyes pleading with me. He was begging for any scrap of shared experience, anything to prove he wasn't hallucinating the patterns he saw in the chaos. "I just need to know I'm not the only one. Have you seen it? Anything? A flicker that repeats? A sound that doesn't belong? Anything at all?" He was a drowning man, and the rules were a stone. My instinct, my training, every alarm bell in my head told me to press the button, to report the anomaly, to retreat into the cold safety of protocol. But looking into Silas Kane's terrified eyes, I saw a reflection of my own burgeoning fear. He wasn't the serpent in the garden. He was the first man to taste the fruit, and he was here to tell me it was poison. For the first time since I'd arrived, I hesitated. And in that moment of hesitation, I had made my choice. My silence was all the answer Silas needed. A flicker of relief, desperate and fragile, crossed his face. He pushed off the wall and approached the console, his movements quick and nervous, like a bird in a room full of cats. He pointed a trembling finger at the monitor for Unit 6. "Watch," he breathed, his eyes glued to the screen. "Don't just look at it. Watch the patterns." On the screen, the impossible being in the dark fluid continued its silent, hypnotic ballet. Its fins, those membranes of shifting, internal light, pulsed and flowed. To a casual observer, it was a beautiful, random display, but Silas was not a casual observer. "They're not random," he whispered, his voice a torrent of manic energy. "I've been logging them for months. The sequences, the color shifts, the duration of each pulse. It's a language. But it's not just communicating, Thorne. That's the simple, easy answer. This is something else." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "It's rehearsing." I stared at the screen, trying to see what he saw. The lights swirled, a symphony of violets and deep blues, then flashed in a rapid sequence of emerald green. "Rehearsing what?" I asked, my own voice sounding hoarse. "Equations," Silas said, the word hanging in the air like smoke. "Not math as we know it. This is visual, conceptual mathematics. I think it's learning how to manipulate space-time. The lights, the patterns, they're the formula. Every flicker is a variable, every color a constant, It's practicing, Thorne. It's figuring out how to break the laws of physics, and it's using its own body as the blackboard. A cold dread, intellectual and profound, began to creep up my spine. This was a hypothesis so far beyond the pale of known science that it sounded like the ravings of a lunatic. But as I watched the precise, deliberate dance of light in Unit 6, a terrifying corner of my mind admitted that it felt right. Remembering the oddity from my own initial tour, I found my voice. "The creature in Unit 4, I said slowly. "The one with the plated leg. It was tapping on the glass." Silas's head whipped around, his eyes wide with a new kind of alarm. "Tapping?" "Yes, a complex, non-repeating sequence, with its foot. It has 6 toes." Silas recoiled as if I'd struck him. He took a physical step back from the console, his face draining of all color. "No," he whispered, the single word choked with genuine horror. "No, that's not right. That's not possible." "What? What's not right?" "The toes," he hissed, his hands flying to his head. "I saw its full schematics when they brought it in 3 months ago. Russo and I were on shift. It only had 5 toes, Thorne. It was a pentadactyl limb. 5. It's not supposed to have 6. He began to pace, a caged, terrified animal. "It's learning. Oh God, it's learning from the others. They're not supposed to do that. The units are isolated. The materials in the walls, the filtration systems, the frequency dampeners, they're designed to prevent any cross-communication. But it's happening." He stopped and looked at me, his eyes burning with a terrible, dawning comprehension. "They're forming a network. They're sharing data." He gestured wildly, a man connecting invisible dots in the air. "My section, Section B, I have a creature in there, a silicon-based geology. It's inert, or it was. A week ago, after a series of high-intensity light pulses from Unit 6, my specimen started growing crystalline structures on its skin. Symmetrical, perfect, hexagonal structures. It's reacting. It's evolving in response to a stimulus it shouldn't even be able to perceive." The pieces clicked into place with an awful, sickening finality. The tapping in Unit 4, the lights in Unit 6, the whispers from Unit 7, the new growths in Section B, they weren't isolated incidents. They were signals in a clandestine conversation, a conspiracy of monsters. Silas gripped the edge of my console, his knuckles white. His manic energy was gone, replaced by a stark, lucid fear. He looked at me, and I saw a man who had flown too close to a truth that burned. "Be careful, Thorne," he said, his voice trembling, almost inaudible above the facility's hum. "Curiosity is a gravity well here. Don't let it pull you in. It will tear you apart, piece by piece, until there's nothing left. Curiosity is a gravity well here." Silas's warning echoed in the oppressive quiet, a ghost of a sound that clung to the air long after he'd spoken it. But he was no longer a man giving warnings. He had moved past fear and into a state of feverish, single-minded obsession. He paced before the console, not with terror, but with the frustrated energy of a genius on the cusp of a revelation. "The camera," he said, stopping abruptly and turning to me. "Its power field, the very act of its electronic observation, its interference, it's corrupting the data. It's like trying to listen to a whisper next to a roaring engine." "Silas, that's insane," I countered, my voice low and urgent. "Those systems are in place for a reason. We don't know what would happen." "No, we don't. That's the entire point," he shot back, his eyes alight with a dangerous fire. "Russo was unwritten because she got too close to a question. I am holding the answer in my hand, and it's being blurred by our own damn equipment. I need a clean reading, Elias. Just 30 seconds of pure, unadulterated signal." He moved toward a secondary access panel on the side of the console. My own training, the cold, hard-won instinct for self-preservation, screamed at me. I stood up, my heavy uniform feeling cumbersome and slow. "Don't," I pleaded, my voice cracking. "Think about the rules. Think about what this place is." "I am," he retorted, his fingers flying across the keypad, inputting a code I didn't know. "I'm thinking about what this place really is. It's a laboratory, and we are the only ones asking the right questions." I reached for him, my gloved hand closing on his shoulder. "Silas, no!" But it was too late. He hit the final key. The screen for Unit 6 went dark. For a single, heart-stopping moment, there was only the deep, familiar hum of the facility, a perfect, profound silence. And then the sound came. It wasn't a noise for the ears, but for the skull. A high-frequency shriek that bypassed all hearing and vibrated directly against my bones, so piercing it felt like my teeth would crack from the pressure. My hands flew to my helmet, a useless gesture against a sound that was already inside me. I watched, paralyzed, as the massive, reinforced wall of Unit 6 did something impossible. It didn't crack or shatter. There was no impact. It simply dissolved. With a soft, dry hiss, like a billion grains of sand being poured at once, the transparent barrier lost its integrity and cascaded to the floor in a shimmering, useless pile. The creature poured into the corridor. The dark fluid from its habitat flowed out like a tide of ink, and the being itself was now free. The bioluminescent fins flared with an impossible, blinding light. They pulsed with a terrifying glory, projecting a celestial map across the walls and ceiling of the corridor, a star chart of an unknown galaxy filled with alien constellations and spiraling, unfamiliar nebulae. Silas's theory was true. He stood frozen, not by fear but by absolute, soul-shattering awe. His face, illuminated by the otherworldly glow, was rapturous. He was a scientist witnessing the proof of his wildest hypothesis, a prophet seeing the face of his god. He didn't even flinch as the creature's head, a smooth, featureless vortex of shimmering, warped space, turned toward him. One of the long, razor-sharp fins extended slowly, deliberately. Before it struck, it projected a new image. A perfect, glowing, anatomical map was superimposed over Silas's body, the light tracing the intricate pathways of his nervous system, highlighting his spinal column and the complex web of his brain. It was not an act of aggression, it was an act of analysis, of consumption. Then the fin struck. There was a soft flicker, a fold in the light, and Silas Kane was simply gone. He wasn't dead. He wasn't thrown across the room. The space he had occupied was now empty. The glowing star chart that had been projected onto him now fell upon the blank floor behind where he had stood. He had been erased from reality as easily as a line of incorrect code. The vortex of a head turned toward me, hiding behind the console. The shriek stopped. In the ringing silence, I felt a cold, analytical pressure bloom inside my mind. It wasn't a voice, it wasn't a whisper. It was a pure, genderless concept, inserted into my thoughts with surgical precision. You observe, you adapt, you are useful. Then, as gracefully as it had emerged, the creature retreated into the pooling darkness of its former cell, its light dimming, leaving me alone in the sudden, deafening silence, my world irrevocably broken. My hand, slick with sweat inside its glove, closed around the red phone. The weight of it felt immense. A direct connection to a system I now understood was not designed for rescue, but for damage control. The lingering concept from the creature, "You are useful," was a cold comfort, a verdict that had spared me Silas's fate. I lifted the receiver. The line was dead silent. "Containment breach," I managed to say, my voice a ragged whisper. "Unit 6, the corridor is compromised." I couldn't bring myself to say more. How do you report that a man has been unwritten from the fabric of the universe? I didn't have to wait long. The response was unnervingly swift. A door at the far end of the hall slid open, and they emerged. The cleaners. There were 4 of them, dressed in sealed, seamless black gear that seemed to absorb the ambient light. They didn't walk. They flowed into the corridor with an unnatural, synchronized grace, like puppets controlled by a single, unseen hand. When one turned his head to survey the dissolved barrier, the other 3 turned their heads at the exact same moment, to the exact same degree. They moved as a single organism. They did not acknowledge me. I was furniture, a part of the scene to be worked around. One of them raised a canister, and began spraying a fine, almost invisible mist into the air. It was odorless, but as it drifted toward me, a strange lethargy settled over my mind. The razor-sharp edges of my terror began to soften. The sequence of events, Silas at the console, the shriek, the horrifying anatomical projection, started to feel slippery, like a dream you struggle to hold on to after waking. I knew something awful had happened, but the specific, visceral details were becoming foggy and unreliable. Two of them began work on the pile of shimmering dust that was once the Unit 6 barrier, sweeping it into sealed canisters with silent, efficient movements. The other two went to my monitoring station. They didn't wipe it down. They didn't try to repair it. With a few precise, coordinated actions, they uncoupled the entire console from the floor. They wheeled it out of the room, a throne that had witnessed a divine and terrible act, and a moment later wheeled in a new one, identical in every way. They were not just cleaning the scene. They were removing the evidence, excising the memory from the very room itself. When they were finished, the lead cleaner, fractionally taller than the others, approached me. He stopped a few feet away, and for the first time, I felt seen. He held out a small, plain box. "Mr. Kane's employment has been concluded," he said. His voice was a flat, synthesized monotone, utterly devoid of inflection or humanity. He placed the box on the edge of the new, sterile console. "For all official purposes, he no longer exists." With that, he and his team retreated as they had come, a silent, four-part shadow vanishing back down the hall. I stared at the box. Inside, I knew, would be a locker key and a final paycheck, the mundane, bureaucratic artifacts of a life that had been violently, impossibly extinguished. They had not just cleaned the scene, they had edited reality, and I, with my chemically fogged memory, was the only living witness. The rest of my shift passed in a blur of disquieting calm. When the clock finally chimed 0700, I stripped off the heavy uniform and walked toward the exit, feeling hollowed out. Director Valerius was waiting for me in the same antechamber where I had signed my contract. Her expression was, as always, a perfect mask of neutrality. "Unfortunate," she said, her voice cutting through the hum of the facility. She wasn't looking at me, but at a point just past my shoulder, as if reading a report only she could see. "Mr. Kane chose to become part of the data rather than simply record it, an occupational hazard for those who lack discipline." She finally met my gaze, and her eyes were as cold and deep as the void in Unit 7. "You, however," she continued, a subtle shift in her tone that might have been approval, "have shown an admirable capacity for survival. You understand. You are not here to understand. You are here to endure." It was not a commendation. It was a confirmation of my function. I hadn't been brave or clever. I had been afraid. I had hidden. I had obeyed my most primal instinct, and in this place, that was the most valuable trait of all. I was a component that had passed its first stress test. Director Valerius didn't dismiss me. Instead, she produced a new binder from a locked compartment beneath her desk. It was not the standard vinyl-covered issue I had seen used for other protocols. This one was bound in a material that felt like cool, dry skin, unnervingly supple to the touch. The title was stamped on the cover in stark, silver letters. Asset Integration Protocol, Specimen Chimera. "Your duties are being expanded, Mr. Thorne," she stated, sliding the binder across the polished surface. It stopped directly in front of me. "Given your resilience, you have been selected to oversee the development of a new asset for Unit 4. I stared at the binder, a chill tracing a path down my spine that had nothing to do with the facility's ambient temperature. Specimen Chimera. The name itself was a warning. My mind flashed to the six-toed foot, the extra digit it had grown. An evolution. A change. The previous occupant of Unit 4 was a static specimen, Valerius explained, her voice as dispassionate as if she were discussing crop rotation. Predictable, limited. This new asset is more dynamic. It possesses a unique capacity for biointegration. I opened the binder, The first page was a diagram of a shapeless, gelatinous mass, little more than a biological blank slate. Valerius's voice continued, a cold narration to the horrors depicted on the page. It doesn't just mimic what it observes, Mr. Thorne, it assimilates. It learns by consuming and integrating the biological and neurological patterns of observed subjects. It is the ultimate adaptive organism. I turned the page. The next diagram showed the same shapeless form, but now it had sprouted a crude limb, a rough approximation of an arm. Beside it were notes, detailing the exposure of the specimen to its first handler. I kept turning. With each page, the creature became less of an it and more of a he. A posture began to emerge, a familiar slump to the shoulders I recognized from a photo in the handler's file. A nervous tic was noted. A repetitive tapping of the fingers, identical to the one described in the observation log. A set of eyes, brown and wide, appeared in the amorphous head, a perfect copy of the man who had stared at it through the reinforced barrier day after day. The final diagram was at the back of the binder. It was an almost perfect human silhouette, shrouded in shadow but undeniably humanoid. It stood with an eerie stillness, its form a patchwork of traits stolen from its observers. Below it, a single stark label, containment failure, stage 4. My blood ran cold. The six-toed foot wasn't just a random mutation spurred by the network Silas had discovered, it was a deliberate act of learning. The creature in Unit 4 hadn't just been tapping a message, it had been practicing a new piece of itself it had acquired from somewhere or someone. They hadn't put a new specimen in Unit 4, they were building one, and my job was to watch, to be observed, to be a source of new material. Your predecessor in this role, Mr. Kane, Valerius said, and the casual mention of his name was a physical shock, provided an invaluable data set on the subject of intellectual curiosity and its physiological manifestations. An excellent, if terminal, contribution. I closed the binder, the feel of its strange cover clinging to my fingers. I was no longer just a warden. I was now a curriculum, a textbook for a monster. The facility wasn't a prison or a lab. It was a filtration system designed to distill the most complex organism, a human being, down to its most useful parts. And I was the filter. I walked back to my new console, the weight of the Chimera binder, a heavy, damning presence in my hands. The corridor was silent, the dissolved wall of Unit 6 replaced with a new, seamless barrier, as if nothing had ever happened. But the air felt different, charged with a terrible awareness. I was a part of it now, complicit in its obscene purpose. As I walked past the suffocating, absolute darkness of Unit 7, a new whisper reached out to me from the void. It was not my voice this time. It wasn't a memory dredged from my own childhood. It was a perfect, chilling echo of Silas Kane's reedy, frantic voice, made thin and distant by the impossible space that had consumed him. "It's cold in here, Elias," the whisper said, a final desperate message from the other side of reality. "It's so cold."